All right, folks, I can't remember what episode number this is, but I'm really happy to have Dr. Erec Smith with me today. He is an associate professor of rhetoric and composition at York College. He got his PhD, I believe, at the University of Illinois in 2003. He has a book out that I can't wait to read, but I just can't afford it right now. But hopefully we'll talk about it a little bit. It's called A Critique of Anti-Racism and Rhetoric and Composition, the Semblance of Empowerment. I've watched a number of podcasts where he's being interviewed and talking about that book, and I found it really intriguing. I've agreed with a lot of what he had to say and what some of the folks interviewing him had to say. So he was kind enough to make time today because he doesn't know me from Adam. I'm some just strange guy out in the middle of nowhere, and he was willing to come on and talk to me about his book and his concerns about anti-racism. I shared with him that I still identify kind of as an anti-racist activist and have done that work for about 3 decades now. So that's where we are today. So Erec, thank you again for coming on this thing and having the conversation. I'm excited. I'm also a little nervous, if I'm honest, because one of the things I do here is try to reach out to white conservatives to try to talk along political lines, and it's been a total failure in many ways. But it's always great to have somebody on that's going to push me and challenge me to hopefully see things in a different way. So thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me. I want to start, I want to make a correction that can also double as a segue
Okay.
for our conversation. I got my PhD at University of Illinois at Chicago.
Okay.
So it's the Chicago campus. And I say that for 2 reasons. Well, one, because it's correct.
Right.
But also because if I do start getting controversial, I don't want people to start contacting the Rhetoric and Composition Department at University of Illinois, and
get the wrong school.
But also, I don't mind that they do that for UIC, because UIC, University of Illinois Chicago, is already under fire because a professor had a question on an exam that involved reference to the N-word. It was in asterisk,
right.
But obviously it was the N-word. And this apparently traumatized his Black students to the point where he got into a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
And I see that as, another instance of the disempowerment that is, a strong and salient part of contemporary anti-racism.
Yeah. Well, and when you say, because one of the struggles I have with John McWhorter and Coleman Hughes and some other folks, when they've defined, and they often don't define these terms before they start talking about them, right? But when they do, and when I've heard them, they're not talking about the same thing I'm talking about, at least how I learned it, right? Because during my career in activism, I mean, I heard of the first mentions of whiteness I heard were in a community organizing workshop in New Orleans. It hadn't really, this was before the whole whiteness industry permeated the academy, I would say in the early 90s. I mean, folks of color have been writing about whiteness, but white scholars haven't necessarily. So one of the things is when you talk about anti-racism, are you talking about primarily in the academy or also outside the academy? Does this include BLM, or does it include, other folks of color that are organized around stuff that would identify as anti-racist?
I am talking about the academy and beyond.
Okay.
So I'm talking about people doing anti-racist theory, pedagogy, as well as people doing anti-racist activism. And I should specify that, I'm, a proponent of anti-racism. It's just not the kind of anti-racism that I see as a problem. That kind of anti-racism is born out of critical race theory, but is really taken through the filter of people like Robin DiAngelo, Ibram Kendi, and it's turned into something else. I think a lot of critical race theorists from back in the day, some of the seminal characters are kind of getting a bad rap. They had a lot of pretty good ideas, helpful ideas, but a lot of their ideas are being, for lack of this is the right term, bastardized into what it is today. So.
Yeah. When you're one of the few people, one of the critiques I've had of Brett Weinstein and other folks, and anybody critical of identity politics, I wish folks would devote a little time to talk about the origin of identity politics, right? Like they came out of largely Black feminist thoughts, my understanding, right? But it was folks really kind of grappling theoretically with their lived experience. Right. But it gets kind of talked, that whole history, right, versus its, transformation and distortion gets lost as if it's always been what it is today. I mean, would you agree with that?
I agree so much that in my last book, A Critique of Antiracism in Rhetoric and Composition, I make a point to not use the term identity politics because that was coined by the Combahee River Collective,
yeah.
Right. And they were saying that, we have to have interest in our own issues, but we also have to, have coalition with other people who want the same things, but for slightly different reasons. Right. We have to have these partnerships and we have to create networks. That was turned into, my identity is my ethos, and that's all I need. I don't have to explain things. I don't have to give you empirical evidence of any kind of racist incident because I'm this or that. That's all the authority I need.
Yeah.
So because of that, what people would typically call identity politics, I call it a primacy of identity. Which focuses on, narcissism, the lived experience as the primary epistemology, right? Racial essentialism, and the ignoring of context, which is where we get the idea that impact always trumps intent. I get that. I get
kind of
why.
Racism as a result kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I agree with you. To the point where I don't use that term, identity politics.
Yeah, because when I remember reading Richard Delgado's book was, I think, one of the first ones on critical race theory, which folks call CRT, right? And I think the things that moved me, and this is in sociology, where when you're specializing in race and ethnicity, it was only until the mid 90s that the question of white racial identity was even in the discipline, right? And that was kind of one of the beautiful things of critical race theory, was it pointed out the normative nature of sociology and that it was loaded in a way not to ever question the dominant racial group, right? So that's that was transformative in many ways, as well as kind of where the trajectory and the history of where whiteness came from as a legal status for citizenship, right, as well as a social status for just moving through the world. So that when I think of critical race theory, I think of kind of going back to that place. And in all fairness, I haven't stayed on top of the literature, and kind of I did a presentation in 2015 at the Pacific Sociological Association where I was critiquing the industry of whiteness, right? And also, what I think is, I kind of coined what I saw in the Pacific Northwest as progressive racism. That, where I live now, folks are just straight up, to a large degree, clear about how they feel about immigrants and everybody else that's kind of not white. But in the Pacific Northwest, it was people who, like you said, took on an identity and were performing a lot of times and would put their Black Lives Matter sign in their gentrified neighborhood and could talk about privilege all day long. But in terms of actually talking about, well, how do we change structures and institutions, the conversation stopped,
Right.
So that's what, when I think about those things, and as well as racism too, I don't see folks distinguishing that there might be multiple forms, because the way I was trained, and it kind of makes sense to me, is that there, individual racism is a little bit different than, over policing a neighborhood, right? Because it's policy, or what in social we would call cultural racism, where we have, symbols of the Confederacy on our public property, right? And so when I hear critiques about all this, I don't think there's a lot of specification among the folks that are emerging. And I think your voice will, in your book, I know right now you're probably catching hell but it does seem like there is, do you feel like the tide is changing?
Yes, I do feel like the tide is changing. Not everybody does, and that's fine, but I think the tide is changing, and I think it's changing lately. I think the tragedy in Atlanta last week created the rhetorical context for Asian Americans to start speaking up about contemporary anti-racism. And I mean, I don't know any specific names, but a lot of people are coming out and saying, you know, this critical race theory version of anti-racism isn't something they can get behind. Right. So I think that's going to change things a little bit. I think voices like mine, McWhorter, Lowry, Coleman Hughes.
Yeah. Glenn Lowry.
Those people are more prominent than I am. I'm not trying to.
You're on your way, though, I think you're on your way. Yeah.
Well, more people of color have to start speaking out.
Yeah.
About you know, not just that it's nonsensical, but that it's actually disempowering the people of color. Right?
Can you say more about that so folks will know kind of why that's a subtitle in your book?
Right. So there's a semblance of empowerment, right? This performance, as you mentioned before.
Right.
And this empowerment comes from what I call the primacy of identity. You know, lived experience is all I need. You know, it's a kind of it's a grab for dignity. You know, in a lot of ways. But there's also what's called prefigurative politics. Now, prefigurative politics, in its rightful manifestation, is performing the world you want to see, the world you want to bring about. So Occupy Wall Street was famous for this. They had the camps, they had you know, unilateral leadership, right? A lot of dialogue, a lot of conversation, a lot of addressing of real issues. They tried to do that anyway. In principle, they were doing that. And you can read, you know, examples of this from Jonathan Smucker's book, Jiminy How To. I recommend.
I'm going to order it. I heard you reference it, and I was like, man, I got to get this book.
Right. So he opened my eyes to this, and he said, prefiguration without actual strategic politics is just theater, right? And he's right, and I see that all the time. It's just theater, you know. Virtue signaling is just theater, right? You know, getting a name off of a building, right, is just theater. You know, how is that really helping, you know, really downtrodden people? How is that helping, you know, with homelessness and crime?
Right? Burning the flag in Portland, the downtown Portland, Oregon.
Right. Look what I did. Yeah. So, right. So that's what I see as disempowering. Also, I think it's just disempowering to the, you know, the Black individual, right? You know, I have no agency, apparently.
Right.
I have no mental and emotional resilience. If I sneeze and a white person doesn't say bless you quickly enough, right, I need to be consoled, right? That's disempowering as well. And I think what it does is it paints people of color in this infantilized light, right?
Of their kind of own fragility.
Right. There's Black fragility too, right? But according to Robin DiAngelo, who's going to save us, right? You know, we don't have enough agency to deal with this, so we have to be protected, right? And I don't know if that was her intent, but that is what's happening. So I think it's disempowering for all those reasons.
Yeah, I haven't read her book, but I that article floated around, I think, before she wrote the book. It was floating around in Portland, right? And the way I took it, and again, I haven't read the book, so I can't make an informed comment about it, but and someone who's kind of had cross-racial dialogues and facilitated those over the years, there is, and folks of color like bell hooks and, you know, Black feminists have written about the fragility of white women when you start talking about race, right? And the white tears. So I haven't read the book because I've watched a few talks, but so where does this all go? I mean, and what are your biggest concerns within the academy? I mean, because a part of it and a spinoff is probably censorship and cancel culture, right?
Right. Within the academy, well, it's an inherently anti-intellectual group, right? critical inquiry is dead. That means you're, to question my statement, right? Or even ask for elaboration, right, is considered some kind of racist act. I was once accused of trying to silence somebody by asking her to elaborate on what she just said, right? So in trying to get her to talk more, I was accused of getting her to talk less,
Right.
like I was doing some kind of gotcha moment.
Right.
And that brings us to Wayne Booth. I know you wanted to talk about listening rhetoric and things like that. He, in his book, I have it right here, The Rhetoric of Rhetoric, right? He talks about listening rhetoric as basically defined as, I'm going to listen and try my best to figure out where you're coming from, to empathize with you, to see the common ground, and hopefully you do the same to me, and we can arrive at the truth. Not what we want to be true, but the truth.
Yeah.
And there are versions of listening rhetoric. That's listening rhetoric A, right? Listening rhetoric B is, I forget exactly what it is. I could read it from you, but I'm not going to.
That's okay. Yeah.
Listening rhetoric C is, I'm going to listen to you, but only to find the weaknesses in your argument so that I can beat.
Right.
Right. When people try to ask questions or try to understand where a person is coming from when they give their lived experience, they're suspected of doing listening rhetoric C, right? Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State College was trying to have listening rhetoric A, right? But they were sure he was listening rhetoric C.
Right.
You're going to use conversation and reason and things like that to squelch us, not to understand us. Right. So that's the idea going on here, and I see that in academia. You can't be a rhetorician and squelch conversation.
Right.
You can't do that. I'm not going to be a lifeguard and complain about wetness. It's part of the work.
Right.
Right. You can't do that. So it's destroying academia. It's definitely destroying my field.
Right.
Right. Now, that being said, I know at the risk of rambling, that being said, there are a lot of good things going on in my field as well, regarding the idea that we shouldn't stigmatize other dialects, right? Linguistic justice. We should stigmatize people for saying ain't instead of isn't. They may have some profound ideas behind that dialect that you don't see as legitimate. We shouldn't do that. Especially in speaking. However, that gets extended to, it's a act of racism to teach English that's deemed standardized, right? And I think that goes a little too far. So yeah, there are good things, but ultimately I see a lot of dangers for my field in particular and academia at large.
Yeah. Can we talk about truth for just a second? Because, in Soc and I think Hooks or maybe Audre Lorde or something, the whole notion of positionality, right? Because I had an exchange with a white conservative recently. He was ranting about Stacey Abrams. And so in Georgia, I don't know if you've aware, there's kind of this voter suppression. There's a House bill that's been presented that will change how people vote, particularly after this election and so forth. And so anyway, this guy asked me a question about voting. And I answered it the way I interpret it. He asked me if there's anything that ever gets in the way of voting. And I thought he was talking about the candidates.
Yeah.
Right. Not the actual act of voting. And so he gets on a radio talk show and rants how I dodged his question versus, and that's his truth, right? Whereas I just read the question fundamentally differently and would be glad to answer his question. So when we I guess I'm asking a question about truth. If we're really trying to understand one another, is it fair to say there might be multiple truths based on who you are?
There are multiple interpretations, right, of the truth and things like that. And those interpretations, I'm not saying they're invalid by any means.
Yeah.
I'm saying that because of the multiple interpretations, all the more reason to talk, all the more reason to have conversation and understand where those interpretations come from and why they are. right? I think conversation is imperative because of that.
Right.
But the my truth thing overlaps with the lived experience thing.
Right.
And that gets dangerous because you may be looking at something, you may look at something and see something completely different because you're projecting something from the past onto something in the present.
Right.
Understandable, but that's not an accurate assessment of what's going on.
Right.
In my book, I talk about how a scholar, a prominent scholar in my field, took a quote from me and totally changed it into something I didn't say. He literally replaced "and" with "but." Right? Those are very different words.
Yeah.
So that I would say something that he could easily refute. This is the straw man fallacy on steroids. Now, I would tell people this happened. I would tell them that, exactly how he changed my words into something that I would never say. And one person said, well, that's his truth.
Yeah.
And And I was like, you gotta be kidding me.
Right.
So for various reasons, what about my truth? Whose truth is the best, right? Also, what about the truth?
Yeah.
Right? I didn't write that.
Right.
So that's when it gets tricky.
Yeah. When I raise the question because, and again, I don't want to excuse, I'm a free speech guy, right? And when I saw, number one, I lived with somebody who had gone to Evergreen when I was in Portland for a while, right? Evergreen is held up as this incredibly, and it was really ugly, right? It's like an extreme example, but it's also kind of an elite private college, private liberal arts college, right? Where folks who are quote unquote privileged get to go because there's tuition, right? And so there's a part of me that, and I wasn't in the middle of it. I've been in my own little firestorm at Portland, but it didn't surprise me a whole lot, right? And I'm almost 60, so there's this also, I might have more leniency for youth and arrogance. I've been watching if you ever watch any like 1970s debates around race, like on Berkeley campus, there's all these black and white films. It'd be great to do analysis on, like you see some of the same shit, right? Like this youthful, we've got all the answers, you're wrong, right? And it seems to me the mistake when I ask about multiple truths is when somebody claims that they have their truth is truth with a capital T.
Yeah. Which
negates your truth, right? Or negates the possibility that there's an objective thing that we can look at empirically and go, yeah, this is true here. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does make sense. But empiricism is, a lost art. Yeah. When it comes to these situations. I mean, there's a movement called Ethno Mathematics right now, which focuses, and this is K through 12, as well as
this is in Oregon, right?
Yes. But I believe it may also be happening in Washington State. I'm not entirely sure of the details. But the idea is less about, figuring out the right answer to things and more about here's how math was used, to perpetuate racism or something like that. Right. And the assumption is here's how empiricism is used to do it. So there's this mistrust of facts and statistics and things like that, which I think is doing more harm than good. Yes, we need to realize or develop the skill of assessment to make sure we're not being duped. But to dismiss empirical evidence outright is a mistake.
Yeah. What's weird about that, and I heard you talk about it earlier on another talk, like when I was there and what I've seen, and I don't know if you've seen it at York, but there's been more of a push for assessment than in any other time in my 20 years. So I was on the assessment committee in our department, for example, and it was all about, I'm not denying that's happening in K through 12, but there was this move, and I see it here locally in the universities I have affiliations with, where professors more than ever we're developing rubrics. We're, trying to actually be more objective, as well as just in class design, trying to be clear with what objectives are and what are the measurable outcomes, right? So I hear that critique, but at the same time, I think there's this, and I'm not trying to defend the academy, please don't take it this way, but more so than any time in my career, I would argue that some of that assessment work has been about empiricism right across the board. And that again is not Oregon public schools, but you said that this is kind of killing rhetoric in a way. I'm trying to find the quote. And can you just talk a little bit about what rhetoric is to you? Because I've had another person that teaches rhetoric and communication. Sociologists are constructionists.
Yeah.
Right. And language and discourse, and I'm fascinated. I mean, it's reality in some ways. I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah. And there are various rhetoricians who are constructionists. So, there's significant overlap there. The simplest definition of rhetoric comes from Aristotle. He says rhetoric is the ability in any given situation to discern the available means of persuasion, right? And what available means is, gauging your audience and acting accordingly, right? If you're trying to sell a Maserati to a group of mothers against drunk driving, you don't talk about how you love the speed and things like that.
Right.
That might trigger them in some way. So you choose the available means of persuasion, which is something else, another metaphor or figurative language or something like that. That's the simplest definition. Rhetoric goes into how we build ideologies, right? It goes into anti-racism is a very rhetorical situation, right? Because we're changing definitions. Context should matter in rhetoric, but it's not anymore. So that's why I see rhetoric is dying in anti-racism. What's more, in order to have rhetoric, in order to need rhetoric, actually, you need more than one viewpoint existing. Now, if you're putting forth one viewpoint and canceling people for having another viewpoint,
right,
then you're trying to get rid of rhetoric, right? And you may not be doing that outright, but that's basically what's happening. Rhetoric is about finding common ground with certain ideas and things like that. It's about identifying with your audience so that they can understand better what you're trying to convey, right? But if you're not allowed to convey anything other than one thing, what's the use of rhetoric?
Yeah. So how did you fall into this discipline? I mean, what drew you to, because I think you have classes I don't know if you would call it deconstruction, but certainly like we have conversational analysis, but I know you've had like your classes look at some of the stuff that happened at Evergreen. So what drew you to this of all the things that you could study?
Well, that's a long story. I'll try to put it as simply as possible. And I've talked about this before. I grew up, the first 13 or 14 years of my life, I was in a predominantly white context, neighborhood, school, things like that. I experienced, significant racism, right? This was the 80s, so it wasn't,
Nobody's woke yet.
Right. Things that happened then would never fly now.
Yeah.
But I knew that once I graduated 8th grade, I would go to a more diverse high school, and that's where I would find my people, right? I'll finally get away from this crap and find other like-minded Black people, and finally not, be subject to this stigmatization and loneliness, right? And I go to that high school, and they dismiss me because apparently I act too white, right? So
you were like culturally white because of
right. So upon realizing that I had no place to go, right, I always had this curiosity about why people are the way they are, right? And now I wasn't using terms like rhetoric and discourse at the time. I had no idea, but I was talking about rhetoric and discourse.
Right.
So when I discovered the field of rhetoric and composition. I went into graduate school to be, to focus on American literature. But I switched to rhetoric when I realized it was talking about how people construct through language their values, their attitudes, their beliefs, right? The justification for things they do. And I was like, okay, this can work for me. I mean, it's not so far removed from English that it's a different discipline and I have to relearn things, right? I can smoothly transition and it's more of what I want to do.
Yeah.
So there it is.
How you've been received? I mean, because you've mentioned this other places, like what is the response from your colleagues, especially for the latest book?
Radio silence.
So not like direct confrontation, just kind of.
No, I got the confrontation before. I got the confrontation before the book.
Gotcha.
And once the book came out, I mean, I think the strategy is to pretend I'm not here.
And what are they critique? What are they accusing you of?
They're accusing me of white supremacy, basically.
Do you know the logic behind why? Because you're helping maintain white supremacy by offering this critique?
Yes. I was critiquing the idea that teaching a standardized version of English, what I would rather call language of wider communication, which Geneva Smitherman, I believe, coined and uses. Modern United States English. I was not behind the idea that that's a racist thing to do, right? To expect people of color to write in that way. A, it essentializes people of color. B, it denies them a tool that might come in handy one day.
That's where I would go, like to navigate. Yeah.
Maybe they'll come in handy one day, right? And also, students don't pay tuition to learn something they already know.
Yeah.
Right. So I made those points, and for that, I was accused of white supremacy and fascism by people who clearly don't know what fascism means. Yeah. And the fact that I was called a white supremacist by white people made me realize how deep this wokeness was.
Right.
So yeah, I was quote unquote canceled before the book came out. So because of that, I decided to write the book.
Gotcha. Was the grief from faculty, colleagues of color too, or just white folks? Or?
No. Everybody. It was a multiracial endeavor.
Okay.
Right? I was writing a different book. I was writing about rhetoric and composition, and I was writing about language, rhetoric and composition, but I wasn't critiquing current anti-racism outright. I wasn't pointing out all the things that are wrong with it. Yeah. I transitioned the book into that midstream, and I do not recommend that because the publisher was not budging on the due date.
Oh, wow.
I do not recommend revamping your book like 2-3 months before the due date. But I felt like I had to do it.
Yeah.
And maybe some parts of it, read as rushed. I apologize for that. But I'm glad it's out there. I'm glad those ideas are out there, and I'm glad people are reading it.
Yeah. When you were talking about, see, one of the kind of mantras that I was, and I believe this, like as an organizer kind of activist guy, the mantra was we're working towards institutional transformation, right? That white supremacy permeates our culture. It's the dominant culture. So is patriarchy, right? It's intersectionality, right? It's, you can talk about capitalism, militarism, right? All these multiple kind of oppressive systems. And so the idea was, how do you transform? And I think more conservative folks see this as tearing down institutions instead of transforming them. I'm saying that out loud because it makes me wonder if folks think that's what they're doing by doing this. Do you know what I mean? And I don't necessarily believe that's what they're doing, but is that their motivation?
To tear down institutions?
Well, no, to inject and transform, not to tear them down, but for example, we can use a different example. I used to teach courses on masculinity, right, as a kind of gender area. And the idea was it simply that, again, there was no critical analysis. When you talk about gender studies, masculinity, only women had always been studying it, but it was really not a kind of a discipline in terms of what does it look like? What are masculinities? How do they cross culturally, cross class vary, cross racial lines vary? And so just the infusion of a new area of study was seen as an effort to change the institution that omitted that whole body of knowledge. You could talk about core curriculums. For example, I've said throughout my career that most institutions of higher learning are racist, particularly in the state of Georgia, simply because of what they omit. You know, that what does it mean that, you know, as a white student, I don't, in a state with 3 million Black folks, I don't have to learn anything about this segregated history, right? Which is my history too. And I can leave this institution thinking I'm educated. And so the idea would be like an example of institutional transformation is that, you know, we teach a comprehensive history and don't have, and everybody does that as a part of the core. Does that make sense as an example?
Yes.
You know,
I'm all for decolonization, right? Decolonizing the curriculum, as they say, because I initially understood it as, you know, looking at all those things that have been omitted.
Yeah.
So now we're going to add that stuff, right? Now we're going to add more Black history, Black literature, things like that, and we're going to share the center, share the spotlight with you know, studies that are deemed white, right? Decolonization, though, has gone a little bit farther, and now, you know, the classics are inherently racist, right? You know, teaching Shakespeare is inherently racist. You know, these are things that people are saying, right? And that's called decolonization, and I don't think that's the right way to go. So, yes, I'm glad that, you know, things that were omitted are being added now. I think they've been added for quite some time,
right?
And you know, that may be getting better, but the pure cancellation of certain things, I have a problem with.
Yeah. Do you think, because what I see with folks is kind of white anti-racist manifesting a new form of white supremacy when they, I saw this on campus. I saw these white students surround a Black older campus, you know, safety guy and lecture him about white privilege. Like it seems to me, and I can't speak for what's happening with folks of color, but white colleagues of mine, and this has always been the trick in my own life, because I don't know if I was ever felt like I was woke, but I certainly became self-righteous. And there's some interesting psychological theory around racial awareness development. I can't remember the psychologist who did it, but supposedly there's kind of these stages that people go through racially when, if you're in the dominant group, you discover the world's not the way I thought it was, and it's not necessarily equitable, and everybody's not moving through the same realities. And one of the stages she brings up is that there's a tendency for white folks who kind of have this quote unquote awakening, she didn't call it that, was to then become self-righteous and distance themselves from other white folks as if they're now the good white people.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I believe that the study that you're referencing is something that someone else brought up to me a couple of weeks ago, but he also couldn't remember the author and things like that. So I'm dying to figure out.
It's old. I'll find it. It's a racial development theory, and it's a African-American woman, and it was done, it's pretty dated, right? And the stages aren't linear, right? You can kind of go back and forth, but she was one of the first, and I got to say, I was guilty of the same stuff too, right? There's this tendency to become self-righteous, and you see this with most people doing any kind of activist, right? I remember being on the campus of Texas A&M, and, you know, folks were, you know, talking about divestment or capitalism as they're walking across drinking their Starbucks. You know, we're not, when this is something I heard you talk about, I don't think we're a culture that encourages self-reflection or self-knowledge.
No, We don't.
Right.
And
So,
that's a huge part of the problem.
right.
I'm like a broken record when it comes to that.
Yeah.
So empowerment theory is, threefold, right? And, the middle, the interactional is about, trying to get along in groups and things like that. And, the behavioral is about actually getting together and strategizing to fix things in real life. But the first stage, the self-awareness stage, the stage in which each individual has to look at himself or herself or themselves as an individual and figure out, to be more self-aware, to manage one's emotions, outlooks, to figure out ways to feel comfortable taking risks and stepping outside of your comfort zone and not seeing a conversation as an attack, but as a conversation.
Right.
Right? We're not doing that. We're skipping that part.
Right.
That part that necessitates mindfulness and metacognition. We're skipping that, and we need to be focusing on that a lot more.
But how do we do that because this is, I think that's a part of what's going on with folks, as well as we live in this era of hyper individualism. I'm older than you, I think, because you look like a young guy. And what I mean we're in the age of the selfie, right? I keep raising questions with my activist communities about whether old models of movements are even possible that are sustained over time because of individualism, right? But how do we, in a culture that's hyper individualistic, that's built on consumption and material accumulation for self-worth and identity too, right? How do we instill the idea that to know thyself? Well, and I think that's really about us embracing our humanity and our fallibility too, right?
Right.
That I am implicitly biased. I am, I carry all kinds of stuff with me that are shaped by my experience and my position in the world. But I mean, do you have any suggestions for how to move humans to a place where that's even a worthy endeavor?
Well, there's a difference between self-esteem and positive self-regard.
Right.
Any schmuck can have self-esteem.
Right.
Positive self-regard is when you understand your strengths as well as your weaknesses, and you're real about that, and you assess those things and realize, okay, what can I do in this situation? What can I contribute to this situation to ensure the best outcome, right? Given who I am. And then what can I do to improve my weaknesses, right? So it's really looking at yourself as a project, right? And moving from there. Also, I mean, if I can convince people that, half the reason why people are having a hard time conversing, half the reason why white women's tears, stifle conversation, half the reason why people are adamant about their lived experience and don't want to be questioned is because they haven't dealt with the intrapersonal aspect, the self-awareness, the positive self-regard. Right. That's kind of like that fortifies you for those tough conversations, for those struggle sessions, as they're called. And we're not doing that.
Yeah, those what they call difficult conversations or something. But I guess that to me that's normal. Like, I've lived in the deep rural South, right? Because I think, again, the critique I'm hearing from folks that are writing books and it's catching steam, and I hear the discourse and the talking points even among local folks who are not college educated, right? Because it makes it to Fox and it makes it these other places, and then folks consume it, and then it makes it out into the local terrain. But when you live in a place that is where, and I wonder if this is an American phenomenon. I experience a lot of folks in my life, and not just here, but elsewhere, particularly white folks, that to question anything about them, not even as something as sensitive as race, is an affront on their right as an American to believe whatever the fuck they want to believe. You know what I'm saying? Like, and they literally existentially, psychologically, spiritually experience it as an attack. So, for example, the legitimate criticism of cancel culture, which is occurring on campus and so forth, when I challenge local folks who make inflammatory comments about Black voters, or that migrants are spiking our COVID rates, they are now accusing me of cancel culture because I'm asking them for evidence to back up. Now, I'm not making this shit up.
I know you're not.
And this is why, and this is why what's happening that is, again, a legitimate critique in many ways, scares the shit out of me, because I know so many white folks, who are just waiting for somebody that doesn't look like them to say something they want to hear so they can run with it.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't censure you or anybody, any scholar of color, to say whatever you want to say, right? But like, no, I'm not canceling you. You said this thing that implicates 53% of our, 50,000 person community. I want you to prove, show the evidence. That's not, but those folks are experiencing it as cancel culture. Right. And so, and not only that, I was accused of weaponizing race for even raising the question.
Yeah. All right. So, and that's part of a lack of that, interpersonal secure base, right? When you lack that and you go into a conversation or any kind of collaboration, you're not really going into that conversation. You're really going into defending yourself.
Right.
Right. You're walking in like, I'm going to defend myself, not I'm going to open myself up to other people.
We're sparring.
Right. We're sparring. I'm protecting myself here. I'm here to, I'm going to put up a shield instead of open, my heart and mind.
Right.
And that is also part of the lack of self-awareness and the lack of self-management, right? And the lack of a secure base, in ourselves that can allow us to take risks and get out of our comfort zones. I mean, I'm not saying I'm all high and mighty and things like that, but
you're not enlightened.
When I write something and you critique it, you're critiquing that.
Right. It's not personal.
I'm fine.
Yeah.
Now, and you're critiquing my work. I'm like, okay, let's talk. Right. Or even if you do insult me, I don't care.
Right.
A, that's an ad hominem tactic.
Right.
And B, your opinion doesn't mean that much to me.
Right.
And I'm going to crumble, right? Because you don't agree with me or because you're insulting me or something like that. This lack of resilience and grit, is being incentivized in a lot of situations, a lot of anti-racist situations. You are an injured soul, you're a victim. That's going to be your ethos, right? And because of that, you can say and do things that you otherwise couldn't say and do. Right. It's being incentivized. Right. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah. But, and all I'm saying is it exists on the right though, too.
Yeah.
Right. It is. I would say that's Southern culture. That's someone defending a statue that was put up 50 years after the Civil War to their ancestor that they never met, around a myth about what the war. No, I'm serious. Right. And to take the statue down is an existential threat because it strips meaning. Right. Yeah. Back to your identity thing. Right. This is if my identity is built on a mythology that you're attacking, or I perceive you to attack it. So, I guess all I'm trying to say is that that's happening in the academy and among folks on the left. Right. But the right, I don't see a existential core, even folks who claim religious faiths. Right. You would think that, that will be a core sense of meaning and security, where we could have a disagreement and not negate each other's humanity.
Yeah.
But it seems like that's not the case. And I guess all I'm saying is that it happens on the left and it happens in the academy, but I see it in my everyday life.
Yeah. And I've seen it, on the right, to speak generally as well. The need for empowerment, especially that intrapersonal first step that we seem to be ignoring, that is an interracial endeavor, right? Both sides of the aisle are ignoring that. And that's why, heads are bumping instead of coming together, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's, and that's why I talk to my students about, discourse and how we build ideologies and where our values come from and why and how they're constructed, right? not necessarily to give them up, but to loosen the grip, right? Loosen the grip a little bit. Realize that when people are talking about things, it's not an existential threat, right?
But if you have nothing else, there
right,
it
you have
is.
nothing else.
Right.
Right.
When I guess that's the dilemma we're in. And, I live in a place where the threat of violence is very real, like, because it's all personal, and as a Buddhist, I would say nothing's personal, really. But that doesn't make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, the idea of no self in Buddhism.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Basically what that means is, no ego, no solidified,
Right.
reified,
Fixed.
right, fixed
Yeah.
ego. And when there's no self, then the self can't get hurt because there's no self.
Right.
I mean, in that case, I'm not going to get into
Yeah.
that right now. I mean, that's a lot more complicated than I'm making it.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, this cathexis, right? This intense connection to a mythos or a religion, some kind of ideology, as yourself is the problem, especially as you said, when you have nothing else.
Right. But I think it's always dangerous to be certain about anything as well.
Right.
I think that's why I go back to the truth with a capital T question. Like I've done my most damage when I've been certain about something, instead of kind of, open. I guess the other thing about this, and I don't want you to speak for other folks, but again, I think that I don't see specification about the concern when we're talking about the academy. That's one thing, right? But I think there's such big differences between urban and rural and what's happening, right, and regionally through the country, what's happening in terms of this language and cancel culture. And I don't see folks making that distinction. And I also wonder, and it seems to me an assimilationist argument too. And this is something I want to ask John McWhorter, because he brings up Dr. King a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And he, and he's using kind of a definition of racism that is 1950 legal racism, really, state mandated segregation and exclusion, right? Versus the possible more nuanced or structural stuff that happens today. But and then progress. And this is what I'm trying to ask you, and I'm sorry to go all around it, but and I'll just use myself as an example. So my dad had a GED. I go to college, get a PhD, first person, in my family. By every stretch of the imagination, the American dream is opened up to me. I get the mortgage, I get the partner, I'm living the dream. I can buy, I can go out to eat, I can do all these things. And in all honesty, having grown up kind of working class, I just was always uncomfortable with it. Like we don't ever talk about kind of, at least I've never seen it discussed anywhere as I was professionalized, right? What the cost of all that is potentially to us. Right. Yeah. And one of the things I've heard you didn't use this word, but it sounded like what you were describing, feelings alienation.
Yeah.
Right. So, this idea that to be an upper middle class, white collar professional, that there's a code that I have to abide by, and there's a certain level of emotional repression to stay professional. And not only that, I can't really live my values in ways because it might threaten my livelihood. Right. If I speak out too much, I'll get in trouble at the university and so on. And what I'm trying to say is that it seems to me when a lot of folks are worried about the country, or when they measure progress, they're measuring it by dominant culture. And I personally struggle with that in the Kingian sense. And what I mean by that is, I think there's something back to the issue of meaning and depth and sense of self. I don't think King was fighting for us to, in the words of James Baldwin, integrate into a burning house. Right. Or military, those triplets, right, of militarism, of, you know, he didn't call it, I mean, capitalism really is what he's talking about: consumer capitalism, predatory capitalism, racism. And I hear people saying, well, we accomplished, and they don't say it verbatim, but they're suggesting we accomplished King's dream, and I don't think we've accomplished it at all.
No.
You know, and that's what that's the measure they're using to make their argument. Does that, am I being clear?
Yes. Their argument, and I get their argument, is that there are a lot of there have been some legal improvements, right? Policy improvements. Certain barricades have been removed. Right? This doesn't get rid of racism. Right. But it gets rid of those barricades. So, and when you combine the lack of those barricades with the fact that you can't really police people's thoughts, you know, the idea is to chase your dreams now. You can. Right. Some people are going to get in your way, you know, and that's when there's a problem. You know, if somebody calls me the N-word in traffic, I laugh. I don't care. Yeah. But if my boss is racist, that's a problem. Yeah. Right. So I distinguish it that way. And or if my institution just by policy doesn't, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Promote people of color, that's a problem. Right. So I mean, I distinguish between annoying racism, like somebody calling me the N-word in traffic, which is an individual act, right? The racism that can actually stifle my progress, my ability to pursue life and liberty and happiness. Yeah. And my fear in that, though, and this is where I got in trouble in Portland, was the idea of diversity isn't enough. Like, so for example, my university here brought who's the fellow that's head of HUD or was under Trump? Ben Carson. Yeah. Right. So this really happened, Eric. And this is before he announced he was going to run. So our university here, so this is why I don't woke culture. I don't know. They brought Ben Carson in early 2016 and essentially did a fundraiser on campus for him, paid him $43,000 to talk about making America great again. Not bringing him to talk about pediatric neurology, which he was totally credentialed, right? They hold a GOP fundraiser for him because they knew he was going to announce, you know, and Ben Carson's not the, you know what I'm saying? Ben Carson is diverse. If you want to go that route, Betty DeVos was diverse, right? We have a white police chief who's female, right? Who's in many ways more repressive than the last white guy, right? And so when I say this assimilationist thing, when Biden nominated his Department of Defense secretary, who comes out of Raytheon, right, a military industrial, you know, they make bombs. That's not. I don't think that's King's idea of progress. And when I was in Portland, the way I put it was, I had two housemates, queer, lesbian, married women who are executives in a major corporation, pulling down about 500 grand a year. And when Greenpeace is protesting and blocking traffic to keep an icebreaker from going to the Arctic and drilling, they complain about the inconvenience. Yeah. And not only that, probably didn't give $5 to any queer organization locally. Right. And I realized, look, the work I've been a part of for 30 years is not simply so folk can integrate into empire. Right. Yeah. And I don't hear that level of analysis with some of the bigger critics of this, right? That the measure is, oh, I'm now at Harvard or wherever, and if that's your goal, good for you, right? And it's great that you have that option, but it seems to me that some of the standards that progress is measured by are a little troubling, because it doesn't go back to these deeper things about a deeper sense of self and meaning that's not based on something external. Right. It's a variation of that old saying, if you can't beat them, join them. Yeah. And, you know, and there are people who think, you know, if I joined the 1%, then diversity, you know,
Right.
You know, if I join the people who are being repressive, then, you know, look, they let me in. Diversity,
Yeah.
right? That's not really what's going on, and that's not King's ultimate dream.
Yeah.
Especially towards the things he was saying towards the end of his life.
Yeah.
He clearly would not see that as success and progress.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, like you said, you know, this is that doesn't deal with the internal, right? And like I'm trying to say, this idea of empowerment and, you know, working with ourselves, working with others, actually getting things done to improve people's lives. I think that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not about just joining the bad guys so I can feel, you know, like I made
Included.
it. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you know, what is anti-racism like that doesn't do these destructive things that you would promote look like, you know, and is there a way to bring back the more destructive stuff that's happening?
Well, the Greater Good Science Center, I believe, Chloe Vardari and Theory of Enchantment.
Yeah, I've reached out to
Doing,
her. Yeah.
yeah, they're doing a lot of good things, and they're doing things that overlap substantially with empowerment theory. If you read some of the stuff from Vardari and Greater Good Science Center, I mean, it's empowerment theory, right? They're not using the exact words. Some of them are.
Yeah.
That's what it is. So what they're doing, they're working on individual security, or they're trying to, you know, assuage insecurity, so that we can collaborate with open hearts, minds, and wills, right? So that we can actually address problems in society collaboratively and get things done,
Right.
right? So I mean, that's the kind of anti-racism I'd like to see, and I think
Right.
that's the kind of anti-racism that's needed.
Right.
Right?
Measurable outcomes.
Yes. Well, yeah.
Yeah. Well, have you the other thing I'm wondering about, because I've watched a lot of the critiques, but have you done any analysis? Because I was watching you and Benjamin Bryce, and I've watched a number of other folks, and not that y'all did this, but I've seen other folks take glee in critiquing the woke community.
Hmm.
Right. There's kind of this new, you know, oh, like, look how stupid these people are.
I wasn't talking to anybody. I was talking to myself about this
Yeah.
a couple of days ago when I was looking at some Twitter.
It's like a meta thing, right?
Yeah, some tweets and things like that, and I was thinking, you know, I don't get pleasure, you
Yeah.
know, in
Yeah.
critiquing these people. I mean, and a lot of people think I do.
Yeah.
You know, they think I'm a bully or something for critiquing these works. I don't get, I mean, if people are being upset or emotionally hurt by my critiques, um, that's not my point,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? I don't have the most remote concern for insulting you. You know, I see problems and I want to address them,
Right.
period,
Right.
right? So you're right. There are a lot of people out there who are really getting off on trolling the woke.
Well, and
And
it's a bunch of white men.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
and they've created an industry around this too, right? That troubles me deeply.
yeah.
Like, because and have you ever seen the little animation Joshua in the Box?
No.
I'll send it to you because I think you'll dig it. Like, the other, so I see, like, and it goes all the way to Joe Rogan, I would argue. I think the other thing I struggle with those folks is not only this kind of glee and supremacy they're getting about talking about all these folks that are doing really fucked up shit. Don't get me wrong, right? But there's this part of me that wants to ask these, and some of them are heavy players in the podcast world and so forth. Like, what have you done for racial justice? Like, have you ever gotten in the water of the complexity of trying to do this work? In fact, what have you done to make the world better in any sense other than careerism, right? And I don't know a lot of folks, you know, but it's that kind of sideline or Monday morning quarterback kind of. This is complicated stuff, right? And I guess that's the other concern I have about it is Well, and, I've tried to warn the folks, liberal folks, about Jordan Peterson and kind of that whole phenomenon, right? And a lot of what Jordan Peterson says, I think, is legit. I think some of the stuff he says is really jacked. Right. And I don't think it's a new message. I think he's reinforcing a dominant narrative that's been kind of challenged for 3 decades. Right. And it's been interesting to watch him go from somebody who was incredibly assured about just if you just do these things, would have a better world, to now he's suffering. Right. It's in all frankness, I don't want to get off too much on Peterson, but liberal folk, I'll tell you how fragile we are. We can't even listen to the right to figure out what the right's doing.
Right.
I've been on that for 10 years, man. I'm not kidding you. So Jordan Peterson's too triggering. And I'm just like, how are you going to combat this backlash if you can't even listen to their logic, their argument? And not only that, the right did a much better job of learning the talking points of the left.
Yep.
I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah, you can't.
The Ben Shapiro's.
Yeah. That is totally, there are people in my field, who are like, I'm not reading that.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna, no way. Well, if you don't read it, you don't know what it says. Therefore, you can't, actively or adequately refute it.
Right.
But then they're like, well, conversation is something I also don't do.
Right.
There's a leader in my field who says, I mean, I don't talk to people unless I know they agree with me already. This is a rhetorician, so that is definitely going on the left side of the aisle.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that terrifies me about all that, so, the alt-right clung to Jordan Peterson because it's really about individualism. It just reminded me of Ayn Rand, right? This kind of and I wish we don't have time for this, but I want to do a whole thing on the pathology of individualism. We're just not individuals. I didn't give birth to myself. Well,
the point about empowerment theory is that there are 3 parts, right? And they act as checks and balances. The interpersonal component, without the interactional and behavioral, could possibly get solipsistic and devolve into hyper individualism, possibly. Right. But if it's 1/3 of empowerment and the other 2 are about collaboration, right, then you can avoid that.
Right.
And what's more, and this is a Buddhist concept too, right? No person is an island, right? We exist and we depend on each other.
Totally interconnected.
In various ways that we can't possibly see.
Right. Well, and that's not hard to prove. Just ask somebody who claims to be an individual, how do you make gasoline for your car?
Not hard to prove at all.
Right. We're so mutually interdependent, and I guess all that saying, I'm sorry to keep you so long, but I'm so happy to talk with you and have a deep conversation. How did you feel about December 6th? And I know this is for me, these things are all connected in ways, right?
January 6th?
Do what?
January 6th?
Yeah, the attack on the Capitol. And I bring this up because the use of language, taking countries back, making countries, rhetoric was in that. And many of us are, and again, it's a spectrum, concerned that those folks take certain ideas and distort them. Again, like my buddy that uses the cancel culture argument to justify their behavior.
Right. Regarding the quote unquote insurrection on January 6th.
Yeah.
I mean, I am still as much in awe as I was on January 6th watching that footage.
Yeah.
Right. And, these are people who are angry. They feel like they don't have enough power, so they're going to take it by any means necessary, which is an idea that exists on both sides of the political aisle. Nietzsche has this, and I'm going to get in trouble for quoting Nietzsche, but Nietzsche has this line, and thus spoke Zarathustra, the tyrannical madness of impotence, right? So the less power you actually have, the more resentful you are of that, and the more dangerous you
Right.
are, and tyrannical you are, right? I think we saw that manifest on January 6th. They don't think they have any other way of improving the world, so they're going to, tear it down,
Right.
right? And you get that sentiment on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
We saw
Right.
for real and intensely on January 6th.
Right. Well, and that's the thing to me, because I've dealt with neo-Confederates who want to secede, from the Union, and I've dealt with Antifa folks, and they all hate the federal government, think it's tyrannical, right? It's like, man, y'all actually are more alike than than you're apart. Can we just close up with the Buddhism part, if that's okay? Because again, I've taken a lot of your time, and I appreciate it.
Well, what part? I mean, that's
how does this?
podcast.
Yeah, I noticed that you had written an article that I want to read, writing under the Bodhi tree, but because there's some interesting sociology on how sociology is inherently Buddhist.
Yeah.
In many ways, at least that's the argument. So I'm wondering how that factors into your work and your thinking as a professor of rhetoric and communication.
Well, with that article, I touch on Thich Nhat Hanh's inner being, right, which is about non-attachment, right, to anything from material things to an ideology, like we were talking about before. It talks about dependent origination, right? I think no man is an island, which is what we talked about before. And it talks about rhetoric, right? The need to gauge who you're talking to and figure out who this person is and figure out a way to best communicate with this person, not taking this one size fits all kind of way of communicating, but looking at this particular person or this particular group of people and acting accordingly, right? So I try to incorporate all those things as a kind of writing center pedagogy, right, for helping people, with anything, but writing in particular. A lot of my writings on Buddhism deal with dependent origination and the idea that we are affected by our environments, right?
Context, yeah.
Right, and we affect our environments as well, and understanding that can help us coexist.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I'm trying to summarize to the best of my ability.
No, you're doing great.
Now, but I mean, it gets a lot deeper than that.
Right.
But yeah, so that's basically what it is.
Well, I also think of the precept of right speech too, right? Like, really thinking about what we say, why we say it, what's the motivation behind it, like spending that kind of psychic energy before you utter a word. Go ahead.
Mindfulness, right?
Yeah.
Metacognition, thinking about your thinking, right? We don't do that at all.
Yeah.
I was about to say we don't do it enough. I mean, we don't do that at all, right? So, I mean, I think that's a very good first step in the right direction.
Yeah.
But I to get going.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time, and I hope it was okay. I enjoyed it. I look forward to reading the book, and I appreciate you entertaining my questions, because I've been dying to ask somebody them, right? And
good to help.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much. Let me turn this thing off and